Welcome to my channel. My name is Sofia Harper, and before I tell you this story, I want you to listen with your whole heart, because this is not just about a wedding invitation. It is about what happens when people decide your worth without asking who you became. And I am Sofia Harper, and for most of my life my family believed they already knew my ending. I grew up in a house where success was measured in last names and dinner guests and the kind of weddings that made it into society pages. My parents loved order, loved appearances, loved control, and I was the daughter who never quite fit the picture. I was ambitious, but not obedient, curious, but not quiet, and when I fell in love I did the one thing my family never forgave me for. I chose happiness over approval. His name was Daniel, and he was kind and brilliant, and came from a world my parents called ordinary, which was their polite way of saying unacceptable. They wanted bankers, senators, heirs to old money, not a man who worked with community housing and believed in building things slowly with purpose. And when I told them I was marrying him, the room went cold. My mother smiled, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes, and my father said nothing, which was worse, because silence in our house meant judgment already past. They tried to talk me out of it with promises and threats and reminders of everything I would lose, and when I did not bend, they withdrew something far more painful than money. They withdrew belonging. The wedding was planned without me. Conversations stopped, phone calls went unanswered, and then one afternoon an email arrived, short and clean and devastating. It said, due to sensitive family considerations, your presence at the upcoming ceremony would not be appropriate. We wish you well, Sophia. I read it standing in my kitchen, sunlight on the counter, coffee going cold. My own wedding invitation rescinded, not even by a phone call, but by an assistant who signed it with best regards. And that was the moment something in me hardened quietly. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. I did not reply, I did not beg, I did not explain. I folded the email away like a receipt for something I would one day need to remember, and I went on with my life, because life does not pause just because your family decides you are inconvenient. Daniel and I married at City Hall with 2 friends and a borrowed bouquet, and it was perfect in the way real things are perfect. Honest, small, warm. We built a life that was not loud, but it was strong. I worked in nonprofit strategy first, quietly behind the scenes, writing proposals, fixing systems, helping organizations grow without ever needing my name on a wall. And slowly people noticed, not my family, not yet, but people who mattered, people who asked questions, people who listened. Years passed, and my parents' birthdays came and went without calls. My siblings sent polite updates through group emails I was not part of, and when my cousin Amelia announced her wedding, it filled every corner of social media. Chandeliers, imported flowers, guest lists that read like directories of power, and I was not invited again. This time it did not hurt the same way, because I had already learned how to stand without their hands on my shoulders. The night of the wedding, Daniel and I cooked pasta at home, laughed about nothing and everything, and I told myself I was free. But freedom does not mean the past disappears. It waits quietly until the moment it realizes you no longer need it. And that moment came on an evening I did not expect, when an envelope arrived, thick, elegant, heavy paper, my name printed in a careful font, Sofia Harper. No family title, no courtesy extension, just my name. Inside was an invitation, not to a wedding, not to a reconciliation dinner, but to a gala hosted by the Whitmore Foundation, one of the most influential philanthropic organizations in the state. I had worked with them indirectly for years, never as the face, always as the architect behind initiatives that actually changed things: housing, education, access, domestic violence prevention, and now they wanted me there as a guest. Daniel raised his eyebrows when I told him, and smiled, that quiet smile that always meant he already knew something good was coming. The night of the gala I wore a navy dress, simple, tailored, nothing flashy, because I had learned that confidence does not need decoration. The venue was a historic ballroom, light pouring down from crystal fixtures, conversations humming like electricity, and as I walked in I felt it, that shift in the air when recognition begins. People turned heads, whispers moved, not because of my family name, but because of the work I had done. And then I saw them, my parents, my siblings, my cousins, gathered near the donor wall, dressed in the language of privilege. My mother saw me first. Her eyes widened just a fraction, and she leaned toward my father, saying something sharp and urgent. He looked up, and our eyes met for the first time in years, and I saw confusion flicker across his face, because in his mind I was still the daughter who had been quietly erased, not someone who belonged in this room. I nodded once, polite, distant, and kept walking, because I had learned that dignity does not wait for permission. The program began. Speeches Acknowledgements, the usual applause, and then the chair of the foundation stepped forward and began to speak about transformation, about leadership, about the future. And then she said my name, Sofia Harper, and asked me to join her on stage, and the room responded with that collective intake of breath that happens when something unexpected is about to become undeniable. I felt my parents staring as I walked forward, heels steady, heart calm, and the chair placed a hand on my shoulder and announced that I had been elected as the new chairwoman of the Whitmore Foundation, effective immediately, not because of who I knew, but because of what I had built. And in that moment, the world shifted quietly, irrevocably. I looked out into the audience and saw my mother frozen, my father pale, my siblings whispering to each other. And then the chair turned to me, smiled, and said, "Madam Chairwoman, would you like to say a few words?" And I realized something profound, that the same family who had uninvited me from a wedding now had to listen to me speak from a stage they could not control. And I took the microphone and began, not with anger, not with accusation, but with gratitude and vision, because the most powerful response is to become undeniable. And as I spoke, I felt the weight of every closed door lift, because when you build your own table, you do not need an invitation anymore, and this was only the beginning. I could feel every eye on me as I spoke, and yet I felt strangely alone in the best possible way, because the approval in the room did not own me, and the silence from my family no longer scared me. And when I stepped off that stage, applause followed me like a wave that did not ask where I came from, only what I had done. And as I returned to my seat, Daniel was there, standing, clapping, with that look that always grounded me, pride mixed with love, mixed with a quiet kind of strength. And in that moment I knew that everything we had built in the quiet years mattered more than any invitation I had ever lost. The rest of the evening moved like a dream. Donors came forward, board members introduced themselves, people who once spoke over me now leaned in to listen, and somewhere in that blur I felt a presence beside me. My mother stood close enough that I could smell her familiar perfume, the same one she had worn to every formal event of my childhood, and she said my name softly, Sofia, as if testing whether it still belonged to her. I turned slowly and looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a woman who had always chosen comfort over courage, appearances over truth, and for a brief second I wondered if she felt regret or simply shock. She told me she had no idea. She said we would have come to you if we had known, and that sentence landed exactly where it deserved, because I realized it was not an apology, it was a justification. And I nodded politely, thanked her for coming tonight, and excused myself, because I did not need to correct her narrative anymore. The truth was standing on its own. My father approached later, his posture stiff, his voice measured, congratulating me on my achievement, as if it were a distant promotion at a company he did not invest in. He said, "We are very proud of you, Sofia," and I almost laughed, because pride offered after exclusion feels hollow, like applause after the curtain has already fallen. I told him thank you, and wished him a good evening, and that was it. No confrontation, no reconciliation, just distance drawn clearly, kindly, firmly. And as the night came to an end and Daniel and I stepped out into the cool air, I exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding for years, and he squeezed my hand and said, "They finally see you," and I shook my head, smiling softly. No, they finally see what they missed, and that is different. Days passed, emails poured in, meetings filled my calendar, responsibilities expanded, and with them came pressure, because leadership is not just recognition, it is weight, and I carried it willingly, carefully, because I knew what it meant to be invisible, and I would never let anyone under my watch feel erased. And still the past lingered. My family began reaching out, invitations to brunch, to holidays framed as olive branches, but still wrapped in conditions, subtle expectations that I would slide back into the role they preferred, the version of me that was impressive, but obedient, accomplished, but silent, and I declined gently again and again. Until one afternoon my sister called, voice tight, telling me that Amelia, the cousin whose wedding I had been uninvited from, was now seeking funding for a community project and wanted to know if the foundation would consider it. I listened quietly and felt that familiar twist, not anger, not satisfaction, just awareness. I told her to submit a proposal like everyone else, and she said, "But she is family," and I said, "Exactly." And when the proposal arrived, it was weak, underdeveloped, heavy on name, light on substance, and I did what my role required. I rejected it with detailed feedback, because leadership without integrity is just decoration, and the fallout was immediate: calls, messages, accusations of bitterness, of punishment. And that was when I understood that Some people only want proximity to your power, not accountability to your standards. Weeks later, my father asked to meet, and against my instincts, I agreed, because growth sometimes requires uncomfortable conversations. We met at a quiet cafe. Neutral ground, and he spoke first, saying he had underestimated me, saying he had made choices based on tradition and fear, and I listened, because listening does not mean surrendering, and when he finished I told him the truth, that exclusion leaves scars, that invitations withdrawn cannot simply be replaced by congratulations, that respect is not retroactive, and that trust once broken requires more than words. He asked what he could do, and I told him, start by seeing me without conditions, start by asking instead of assuming. Start by understanding that my success is not an extension of your legacy, it is my own. And when we parted, there was no embrace, no dramatic resolution, just a fragile possibility, and that was enough. Time moved forward, and with it came challenges, decisions. Scrutiny. Nights I questioned myself, and mornings I remembered why I started, and through it all Daniel remained my constant, my witness, my partner. And one evening, as we sat at our kitchen table surrounded by papers, plans, dreams, I realized something profound, that the wedding I had been uninvited from had given me a gift. It had forced me to choose myself completely, and in doing so I had built a life that no one could revoke, and the world has a way of circling back, not to reward, but to reveal. And as my family continued to navigate the consequences of their choices, I continued to build, to lead, to open doors for others who had been told quietly that they did not belong, and the story was still unfolding, not in chapters, but in momentum. And I knew without doubt that the girl who once read an email rescinding her place at a wedding had become a woman who no longer waited for invitations, because she had learned how to stand exactly where she was meant to be. Time kept moving in that quiet, unstoppable way it always does, and with every passing week my role grew heavier and clearer at the same time, because leadership has a way of stripping you down until only your principles are left, and I learned quickly that visibility brings both admiration and resentment. People who once ignored me now analyzed every decision I made, every grant approved, every partnership declined, and in that pressure I found something unexpected: calm, because I had already survived the worst thing. I had been erased by the people who were supposed to love me, and nothing after that carried the same sting. My family, on the other hand, seemed suspended in a different timeline, still adjusting to the fact that the narrative they had written no longer matched reality. My mother sent articles featuring my name with short notes attached: proud of you, as if pride could be mailed retroactively. My father forwarded business opportunities, thinly disguised as attempts to reconnect through usefulness, and my siblings oscillated between awkward admiration and quiet jealousy, because success reshapes power dynamics whether anyone admits it or not. And then came the phone call that marked the true turning point. The foundation was planning its annual benefit, the most visible event of the year, attended by donors, politicians, media, the same social circle that once celebrated weddings I was excluded from, and as chairwoman it was my responsibility to oversee it. Theme, venue, guest list, messaging, everything. And as the planning committee gathered around a long table, glass walls overlooking the city, one of the members casually mentioned that my family had traditionally been major attendees and donors, and asked if I would like them included in the planning outreach. The room went quiet, not out of discomfort, but respect, because they understood this was not a logistical question, it was personal. And in that moment I felt the weight of choice, not vengeance, not reconciliation, but authorship. I took a breath and said, invitations will be sent based on contribution and alignment with our mission, nothing else. And that was the end of it. Fair, transparent, unambiguous. When the invitations went out, my family received them like everyone else. No special notes, no back channels, no apologies folded inside. And the irony was not lost on me that years ago my presence had been deemed inappropriate, and now their presence depended on criteria they could not control. My cousin Amelia called again, voice tight, asking if her rejection was personal, and I told her gently no, it was procedural. And for the first time she heard what fairness sounds like, without favoritism. The night of the benefit arrived, and the ballroom buzzed with anticipation. I stood backstage reviewing final details when Daniel stepped in, adjusted my jacket, kissed my forehead, and said, "You ready, Madam Chairwoman?" And I smiled, because the title still felt surreal, not because of status, but because of how far it was from the girl I once was. The lights dimmed, music swelled, and I walked onto the stage. Applause rose, and somewhere in that sea Of faces I saw my parents seated among the guests, not at the front, not in obscurity, just present like everyone else, and I did not avert my gaze, I did not seek it either. I focused on the words I had prepared about impact, about responsibility, about the quiet power of sustained effort, and when I spoke about belonging, I felt my voice steady, because belonging is not something granted, it is something built. After the speech, donors approached, pledges increased, conversation shifted, and I moved through it all with grace, not because I had learned to perform, but because I no longer needed to. And later, as the evening softened, my mother approached again, her expression less guarded this time, and she said, "Watching you tonight, I realize how much I did not know about you." And I looked at her and replied, "Knowing someone requires curiosity, not control," and she nodded slowly, absorbing a truth she could not refute. My father did not approach that night. Perhaps he was learning that access is earned too, and in the days that followed, something subtle changed. My family began speaking to me differently, asking questions, listening without interrupting, stumbling through a new dynamic where I was not the exception, but an equal, and it was uncomfortable for all of us. Growth usually is, and still I kept boundaries, because healing without boundaries is just repetition. The foundation flourished, initiatives expanded, communities responded, and in quieter moments, I received messages from women who saw themselves in my story, daughters who had been sidelined, sisters overlooked, wives diminished. And I answered everyone, because representation is not just visibility, it is responsiveness. And one evening, as I sat with Daniel reflecting on the year, he asked if I ever wished things had been different, if I wished my family had shown up sooner, and I thought about it honestly and said no, because if they had, I might never have learned how to show up for myself. And that realization settled deep, because pain is not something we seek, but sometimes it is the teacher we needed. The story was not about a wedding anymore, it was about reclamation, about redefining worth on your own terms. And as I prepared for the next chapter, new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities, one felt anchored not by approval, but by alignment, and I knew that whatever came next, I would meet it as Sofia Harper, not someone uninvited, but someone undeniable. The weeks after the benefit settled into something quieter, but deeper, like the way the ocean pulls back before revealing how far the shoreline actually stretches, and I found myself waking up each morning not with urgency, but with purpose, because the work was no longer about proving anything, it was about protecting what had been built and expanding it with care and integrity. And the foundation entered a new phase, one that demanded courage rather than polish, because visibility invites scrutiny, and scrutiny demands honesty, and I leaned into that fully. I traveled across the state, sitting in school gyms and community centers, listening more than speaking, hearing stories from women who reminded me of versions of myself that had not yet learned how powerful silence could be when paired with action. And every time someone thanked me for opening a door, I reminded them that I did not open it alone. I built it with help from people who believed in the work, even when my name was not enough to convince anyone. And during one of those trips, my father called unexpectedly, not to congratulate, not to request, but to ask if he could attend a site visit with me, just to observe, he said, and there was something unfamiliar in his voice, not authority, not expectation, but uncertainty. And I realized this was what accountability sounds like, when pride finally loosens its grip. And I told him he was welcome, provided he understood he would be there as a guest, not as a decision maker, and he agreed without argument, which felt like progress, even if it came late. And the day of the visit, he stood quietly beside me, watching as I spoke with local leaders, teachers, parents, and when a young girl tugged at my sleeve and asked if I was the one who helped bring the new program to her school, I knelt down and said yes, and her smile lit up something behind my father's eyes that I had never seen before, not envy, not control, but awe. And afterward, as we drove back, he said softly, "I never imagined you in this world." And I replied calmly, "That was the problem, you never imagined me at all." And he did not disagree. Time continued its steady march, and with it came moments of reconciliation and moments of distance, because healing is not linear and not guaranteed. But what mattered was that I no longer shaped myself around the possibility of acceptance. I had built a life that stood whether anyone approved or not. My mother began visiting occasionally, not to advise, but to listen, sitting at my kitchen table asking about my work, about Daniel, about the choices I made, and sometimes she cried quietly, not to be comforted, but to be honest, and I let her, because honesty was the currency now, not guilt, not obligation. And Daniel remained my anchor, reminding me through his steadiness that love does not require shrinking, and as the year turned, the foundation reached milestones we had once considered aspirational. Funding doubled, outcomes improved, trust grew, and one afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a national conference on leadership and equity. The same social circles that once whispered now quoted my words, and when I stepped onto that stage, I did not think about the wedding I had been uninvited from. I thought about the email that had arrived so long ago telling me my presence was not appropriate, and I smiled, because presence is not something others grant, it is something you claim. And at the end of the talk, a young woman approached me, eyes bright, hands shaking, and said, "My family says I am too much." And I told her the truth, that too much is often just enough for the right room, and that if the room keeps shrinking, maybe it is time to build a new one. And as she walked away, I felt the circle close, not in revenge, but in meaning. And later that evening, Daniel and I sat together reflecting on how far we had come, and he asked if I would ever attend another family wedding if invited, and I considered it thoughtfully and said I would attend if the invitation was honest, not strategic, not conditional, but rooted in respect, and if not, I would send my regards and continue living, because the lesson had been learned, the story had changed, and I was no longer the girl waiting outside the ballroom wondering what she had done wrong. I was the woman inside the room, setting the tone, deciding who felt welcome and why. And that is where I am now, still building, still learning, still choosing integrity over comfort. And if you are listening to this and have ever been told you did not belong, that your presence was inconvenient, that your worth depended on how well you fit someone else's vision, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not too much, you are not out of place, you are not uninvited, you are simply early to the life you are meant to lead. Build it with care, stand in it with confidence, and let the rest catch up in its own time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. This has been my story, and if it resonated with you, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to my channel for more stories about finding your voice and your place in the world. I am Sofia Harper, and I will see you next time.